Number 1. Henry Louis Wallace. He was known as the Taco Bell Strangler, a young man with a warm smile, steady work ethic, and a way of making people feel comfortable. But behind that charm was something far darker. Henry Louis Wallace became one of the most prolific serial killers in North Carolina history. And what made his case even more chilling was how long he managed to evade suspicion, even as the bodies kept appearing. Henry Louis Wallace was born on November 4, 1965, in Barnwell, South Carolina. Raised by a single mother, Wallace's childhood was marked by instability and discipline. His mother was strict, and neighbors later recalled that she kept a tight grip on the household. Wallace himself was described as quiet and polite, the kind of kid who didn't draw much attention. After high school, he joined the U.S. Navy, serving honorably for several years. When he left the service, he returned to civilian life and eventually moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. There he worked at a Taco Bell restaurant, where he became a familiar face to both co-workers and customers. He seemed like just another hard-working guy trying to make ends meet. No one suspected what was about to unfold. Between 1990 and 1994, a string of young women began to disappear and turn up deceased in Charlotte. Most of them were African American women in their 20s, and many of them knew Henry Wallace personally. Some were his co-workers, others were friends or acquaintances. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was someone they trusted. That's what made his crimes so insidious. Wallace would visit these women under the pretense of casual conversation or asking for help. Once inside their homes, he would attack. He would bind them, assault them, and then end their lives, often by strangulation. Afterward, he would sometimes take small items from their apartments, jewelry, electronics, as if the theft was an afterthought to the violence. The first known victim was Tashonda Bethea, found deceased in her apartment in 1990. Then came Sharon Nance in 1992, followed by a rapid succession of others: Caroline Love, Shauna Hawk, Audrey Spain, Valencia Jumper, Michelle Stinson, Vanessa Mack, Betty Bauckham, and Brandy Henderson. By the time Wallace was caught, he had taken the lives of at least 10 women, possibly more. What's haunting is how long it took for the pattern to be recognized. Families of the victims grew frustrated as months passed without answers. Some believed that because the victims were young black women, their cases weren't prioritized. The community demanded action, but Wallace continued moving through their lives undetected. The breakthrough came in March 1994. Wallace had attacked a woman who survived. She gave police a description, and when investigators began connecting the dots, they realized many of the victims had ties to the same Taco Bell restaurant where Wallace worked. They brought him in for questioning. At first, Wallace was calm, cooperative even, but as the interrogation continued, the facade cracked. He confessed, not to one crime, but to 9. He walked detectives through each case in chilling detail, describing how he gained access, how he committed the crimes, and what he did afterward. The confessions were methodical, almost detached, as if he were recounting someone else's actions. Wallace was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. His trial began in 1996, and the prosecution presented an overwhelming case. The confessions, physical evidence, and eyewitness testimony all pointed to Wallace. His defense team argued that he suffered from mental illness and substance abuse, hoping to avoid the death penalty. But the jury wasn't swayed. They found him guilty on all counts. When it came time for sentencing, the decision was swift: death. Henry Louis Wallace was sentenced to death and sent to Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he remains on death row to this day. The case left deep scars on the Charlotte community. Families of the victims have spoken about the pain of losing their loved ones and the frustration of feeling their cases were overlooked. Some have questioned whether more could have been done sooner. Wallace himself has given interviews over the years, offering little in the way of remorse. He's described his actions in clinical terms, showing flashes of emotion only when discussing his own fate. As the years pass, he continues to sit in a cell, waiting for an execution date that may never come. Imagine trusting someone enough to let them into your home, only to realize too late that you've invited in a predator. That's the nightmare Henry Louis Wallace brought into the lives of his victims. His story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks in wearing a friendly face. Number 2, Jack Unterweger. He was a convicted killer who became a celebrated author and journalist, a man who seemed to have turned his life around behind bars and emerged as a symbol of redemption. Austria embraced him. Intellectuals admired him. The media followed his every move. But as it turned out, Jack Unterweger hadn't changed at all. He had simply learned how to hide in plain sight. Johann Jack Unterweger was born on August 16, 1950, in Austria. His early life was chaotic. His mother was a prostitute, and his father was an American soldier who left before Jack was born. He was raised by his grandfather in poverty, and by his teenage years, Unterweger was already in trouble with the law. He cycled through petty crimes, thefts, and assaults. Then, in 1974, at the age of 23, he committed a crime that would define his life. He was convicted of taking the life of 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer. He had strangled her with her own bra. He was sentenced to life in prison. But prison didn't break Jack Unterweger. Instead, it became his stage. While incarcerated, he began to write. He wrote poems, short stories, and eventually an autobiography titled Purgatory or the Trip to Prison. The book became a sensation in Austria. Unterweger portrayed himself as a tortured soul seeking redemption, and the public ate it up. Writers, intellectuals, and even politicians rallied behind him, calling for his release. They argued that he had been rehabilitated through art and education. In 1990, after serving 15 years, Jack Unterweger was granted parole. He walked out of prison a free man, celebrated as a triumph of the justice system. He quickly became a media darling. He was hired as a journalist and began writing about crime and the criminal justice system. He hosted radio shows and gave interviews. He even covered stories about unsolved cases involving women. It was the perfect cover. Because while Jack Unterweger was being praised as a reformed man, women were dying. Between 1990 and 1992, a series of strangulation cases began appearing across Austria, Czechoslovakia, and even Los Angeles, California, where Unterweger had traveled on assignment. The victims were often women working in vulnerable situations, and they were all killed in a similar manner, strangled, often with articles of their own clothing. Authorities began to notice a pattern. Investigators in Austria and the United States compared notes and realized that the timeline of these cases lined up eerily with Unterweger's movements. He had been in Los Angeles when 3 women were found deceased there. He had been in Prague when another victim appeared. The more they dug, the clearer it became. Jack Unterweger was back to his old ways. In 1992, he was arrested and charged with multiple counts of taking lives. He denied everything, insisting he was being framed because of his past. His trial was a media circus. The man who had once been celebrated as a symbol of redemption was now on trial for a string of brutal crimes. The prosecution presented evidence linking him to at least 11 deaths across multiple countries. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Unterweger was being targeted because of his criminal history. But the jury didn't buy it. In 1994, Jack Unterweger was found guilty of 9 counts of taking lives. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never made it to serve that sentence. Hours after the verdict was read, Jack Unterweger was found deceased in his cell. He had taken his own life, using the same method he had used on his victims: strangulation. He fashioned a noose from his own clothing and ended his life in the early hours of the morning. Some saw it as a final act of control. Others saw it as an admission of guilt. The case of Jack Unterweger shook Austria to its core. How had a convicted killer been released and celebrated, only to continue his crimes? The intellectual elite who had championed his release were left grappling with uncomfortable questions. Families of the victims were left without closure, and the justice system was forced to reckon with its failures. Jack Unterweger had fooled an entire country using charm, intellect, and the media to mask the monster he had always been. Imagine giving someone a second chance, only to watch them use that opportunity to destroy more lives. That's the tragedy of Jack Unterweger, a story of manipulation, misplaced trust, and the danger of believing someone has changed simply because they say they have. Number 3. Samuel Little. For decades, he moved through America like a ghost. He drifted from city to city, state to state, leaving a trail of victims that investigators didn't connect for nearly 40 years. By the time the truth came out, Samuel Little had confessed to taking the lives of 93 people, making him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. And yet, most people had never heard his name. Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, but he spent most of his childhood in Lorain, Ohio, raised by his grandmother. As a young man, he was already in and out of trouble: theft, fraud, assault. He was arrested dozens of times across multiple states, but nothing ever seemed to stick for long. He'd serve a little time, get released, and move on. Little was large, intimidating, and he often targeted women who were vulnerable, women living on the margins, women who might not be immediately missed. That was part of his strategy. He knew how to pick victims who wouldn't generate headlines. Between 1970 and 2005, Samuel Little traveled constantly, working odd jobs, staying in shelters, and committing crimes along the way. His method was consistent. He would approach women, often offering them money or drugs, gain their trust, and then attack. He would strangle them, usually with his bare hands, and then dispose of their bodies in remote areas. Because many of his victims were women involved in substance use or street work, their disappearances didn't always trigger immediate investigations. In some cases, their deaths were ruled as accidents or overdoses. Little understood this, and he exploited it. For years, law enforcement agencies across the country had unsolved cases that fit a similar pattern, but no one connected them. Little was arrested multiple times for assault and other crimes, but he was never seriously investigated for homicide. He was just another repeat offender in a system that didn't have the tools or resources to see the bigger picture. That all changed in 2012. Little was arrested in a Kentucky shelter on a drug charge, and his DNA was entered into a national database. It came back as a match to 3 unsolved cases in Los Angeles from the 1980s. Suddenly, investigators had a thread to pull. In 2014, Samuel Little was extradited to California and charged with 3 counts of taking lives. The evidence was strong, and in 2014, he was convicted and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But investigators suspected there was more, a lot more. In 2018, a Texas Ranger named James Holland began interviewing Little in prison. Holland was patient, methodical, and he had a hunch that Little had been involved in far more cases than anyone realized. Over the course of several months, Little began to open up. He confessed to dozens of additional crimes, eventually claiming responsibility for 93 deaths spanning more than 3 decades. What made his confessions credible was the level of detail. Little could remember his victims. their faces, where he met them, what they were wearing, how he ended their lives. He even sketched portraits of many of them from memory. Investigators began the painstaking process of matching his confessions to unsolved cases across the country. As of now, more than 60 of his confessions have been confirmed. Many others remain under investigation. In several cases, deaths that had been ruled accidents or natural causes were reclassified as homicides based on Little's accounts. Samuel Little is currently serving multiple life sentences in California. He's elderly now, in poor health, and confined to a wheelchair. He's given interviews from prison, speaking about his crimes with a disturbing lack of emotion. He's described his victims in detached, almost clinical terms, and he's shown little remorse. In some interviews, he's even appeared to take pride in the fact that he evaded capture for so long. He's become a case study in how systemic failures, bias, resource limitations, lack of communication between jurisdictions allowed a predator to operate unchecked for decades. The families of his victims have had to grapple with the painful reality that their loved ones' deaths went unnoticed for years. Some have expressed anger at the system that failed to protect them. Others have found a measure of closure in finally knowing what happened. The case has also sparked important conversations about how society values certain lives over others, and how those biases can have deadly consequences. Imagine someone moving through the world for 40 years, taking lives and never being stopped. That's the nightmare of Samuel Little, a man who understood the gaps in the system and used them to become one of the most deadly killers in American history. His story is a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied, and that every life matters, no matter how invisible society tries to make it. Number 4, Gary Ray Bowles. He was known as the I-95 killer, a drifter who traveled the East Coast, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. His crimes were brutal, his method was consistent, and his targets were chosen with a chilling specificity. Gary Ray Bowles wasn't just a killer. He was a predator who used trust and desperation as weapons. Gary Ray Bowles was born on January 25, 1962, in Clifton Forge, Virginia. His childhood was troubled. He experienced trauma and instability, and by his teenage years, he was already involved in criminal activity. He dropped out of school, bounced between jobs, and eventually ended up in prison for robbery. After his release in the early 1990s, Bowles drifted along the eastern seaboard, never staying in one place for long. He was often homeless, relying on temporary work and the kindness of strangers to survive. But beneath the surface of a man down on his luck was someone capable of horrific violence. Between 1994 and 1995, a series of brutal crimes occurred in Florida, Georgia, and Maryland. The victims were all older men, and they were all found deceased in their homes. The scenes were disturbing. The victims had been beaten, strangled, and in many cases, objects had been placed over their faces or bodies. Investigators quickly noticed a pattern. The victims were all men who had let Bowles into their homes, often believing they were helping him. Bowles would gain their trust, sometimes by offering to do odd jobs or by suggesting he was in need of assistance. Once inside, he would attack. His first confirmed victim was John Hardy Roberts, a 59-year-old man found deceased in his Florida home in 1994. Then came David Jarman, a 39-year-old in Maryland. Next was Milton Bradley, a 72-year-old man in Georgia. The list continued. Albert Alcee Morris, Walter Hinton, David Merle. Each time, the method was similar. Each time, Bowles took cash, credit cards, or valuables before disappearing. He used the stolen credit cards to travel, and he moved quickly, staying ahead of law enforcement. By mid-1994, the FBI had connected the cases and realized they were dealing with a serial killer. They issued a nationwide alert, and Bowles's face was broadcast across the country. But he kept moving, and he kept committing crimes. In November 1994, he struck again in Jacksonville, Florida, taking the life of Walter Hinton. A few weeks later, he was in Miami, where he ended the life of his final known victim, Albert Alcee Morris. By this point, the manhunt was intensifying. Authorities knew who they were looking for, but Bowles was slippery, and he knew how to disappear. The break came in November 1994. A witness in Jacksonville had seen Bowles leaving the scene of one of the crimes, and the description matched the FBI's profile. Police tracked him to a homeless shelter, but he had already left. Finally, on November 22, 1994, Bowles was arrested in Jacksonville after being recognized by someone who had seen his photo on television. He was taken into custody without incident, and when questioned, he initially denied everything. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bowles was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. His trial began in 1996 in Florida, and the prosecution laid out a clear timeline of his crimes. They presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the stolen items recovered from Bowles's possession. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, pointing to Bowles's difficult childhood and mental health struggles. But the jury wasn't convinced. Gary Ray Bowles was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death and sent to Florida's death row. For over 2 decades, Bowles sat in prison as his case went through the appeals process. He gave occasional interviews, offering little insight and showing minimal remorse. On August 22, 2019, Gary Ray Bowles was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He was 57 years old. In his final statement, he offered brief apologies to the families of his victims, but the words felt hollow to many who had followed the case. The I-95 killer left behind a trail of grief and devastation. His victims were people who had opened their homes to someone they thought needed help, only to be met with unimaginable violence. The case highlighted the dangers of predatory behavior and the vulnerability of those living on the margins. It also underscored the importance of cross-jurisdictional cooperation in catching criminals who move across state lines. Imagine being someone who genuinely wants to help a stranger in need, only to realize too late that you've let a monster into your home. That's the horror Gary Ray Bowles inflicted on his victims. His story is a grim reminder that trust can be weaponized and that evil can wear the mask of desperation. Number 5. Pablo Ibar. He's a man who has spent more than 2 decades on death row for a triple homicide that shocked South Florida in the 1990s. But here's the twist. Pablo Ibar has always maintained his innocence, and his case has become one of the most controversial and debated criminal cases in recent memory. Was he a cold-blooded killer, or a man wrongfully convicted based on shaky evidence and questionable legal tactics? Pablo Ibar was born on January 26, 1970, in Bar Harbor, Maine, but he grew up in Miramar, Florida. His father was a well-known Spanish Jai player, and Pablo himself seemed to be on a decent path as a young man. He had aspirations in sports and spent time working various jobs. But in June 1994, his life took a turn that would define the rest of his existence. On June 26, 1994, a horrific crime occurred in Miramar. Butch Casey, the owner of a local nightclub, his wife Marie, and their friend Sharon Anderson were found deceased in their home. They had been shot execution style, and the scene was brutal. But there was something else. The entire incident had been captured on the home's security camera. The grainy footage showed 2 men entering the house, and it appeared to show one of them committing the crimes. The problem was, the video quality was poor. You could make out general features, but nothing definitive. Investigators worked the case for months, but leads were scarce. Then, in 1994, they received a tip. An informant told police that Pablo Ibar and another man, Seth Penalver, had been involved. The informant claimed Ibar and Penalver had gone to the house intending to rob Casey, and that the situation had escalated into violence. Based largely on this testimony and the security footage, both men were arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Pablo Ibar's first trial took place in 2000. The prosecution relied heavily on the grainy security footage, arguing that the man in the video was Ibar. They brought in experts who claimed the build, movements, and clothing matched. They also presented testimony from the informant, who claimed Ibar had confessed to him. But the defense pushed back hard. They argued that the video was too unclear to make a definitive identification, and they questioned the credibility of the informant, who had a criminal record and was receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. They also pointed out that no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon, linked Ibar to the scene. The jury deliberated and came back with a guilty verdict. Pablo Ibar was sentenced to death. But that wasn't the end. Ibar's defense team filed appeals, arguing that his trial had been unfair. They pointed to issues with jury selection, prosecutorial misconduct, and problems with the evidence. In 2016, a Florida appeals court agreed. Ibar's conviction was overturned, and he was granted a new trial. The retrial took place in 2019, and this time, the defense brought in new experts to analyze the security footage. Some argued that the person in the video couldn't definitively be identified as Ibar. Others testified about the unreliability of eyewitness and informant testimony. But once again, the jury found him guilty. Once again, he was sentenced to death. Pablo Ibar is currently on death row in Florida, and his case continues to generate intense debate. Supporters argue that he's an innocent man convicted on flimsy evidence, and they point to the lack of physical evidence as proof that the state got it wrong. They've highlighted issues with the informant's credibility and the questionable quality of the security footage. International human rights organizations have taken up his cause, and even the Spanish government, Ibar holds dual citizenship, has expressed concern about the fairness of his trials. On the other side, prosecutors maintain that the evidence, when taken as a whole, points to Ibar's guilt. They argue that the security footage, combined with the witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, is enough to uphold the conviction. The families of the victims have also spoken out. They believe justice has been served and that Ibar is responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. For them, the legal battles have been a painful reminder of the violence that shattered their lives decades ago. As of now, Ibar remains on death row, awaiting the outcome of further appeals. His case raises difficult questions about the criminal justice system, the reliability of evidence, and what happens when there's no smoking gun, only a collection of circumstantial pieces. Imagine being convicted of a crime you say you didn't commit and spending more than 20 years on death row based on evidence that others say is too weak to support a conviction. That's the reality Pablo Ibar is living. Whether he's a killer or a victim of a flawed system is a question that continues to divide people. His story is a reminder that the truth isn't always clear, and that justice is sometimes more complicated than we'd like it to be. Number 6. Luis Alfredo Garavito. He is known as La Bestia, the Beast, and that name is not an exaggeration. Luis Alfredo Garavito is one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history, convicted of taking the lives of 138 children, though he confessed to as many as 400. His crimes spanned years, and they left an entire country in shock and mourning. Colombia had faced violence and turmoil for decades, but nothing prepared them for the horror that Garavito unleashed. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born on January 25, 1957, in Geneva, Colombia. He grew up in a large, impoverished family, and his childhood was marked by severe trauma. Garavito later claimed he had been physically and emotionally mistreated as a child, and that he struggled with his sense of self from a young age. As an adult, he drifted through life, working odd jobs and moving from town to town. To those who encountered him, he seemed unremarkable, quiet, polite, sometimes even kind. But beneath that exterior was a man harboring dark compulsions. Beginning in the early 1990s, Garavito began targeting children, particularly boys from poor or homeless backgrounds. He would approach them in public places, markets, bus stations, rural roads, and gain their trust by offering money, food, or work. He posed as a priest, a vendor, or a homeless man himself. Whatever role would make him seem harmless. Once he had lured a child away, he would take them to a remote location. There, he would assault them and then take their lives, often by strangulation or stabbing. Afterward, he would dispose of their bodies in secluded areas, forests, fields, ravines. For years, the bodies of children began appearing across Colombia. At first, the cases weren't connected. Colombia was in the midst of intense internal conflict, and law enforcement resources were stretched thin. Many of the victims came from marginalized communities, and their disappearances didn't always generate immediate investigation. But as the number of bodies grew, patterns began to emerge. The victims were all young boys, usually between the ages of 6 and 16. They had all been found in rural or isolated areas, and many of them showed signs of similar violence. In 1999, investigators finally got a break. A man named Luis Alfredo Garavito had been arrested on a minor charge, and during questioning, inconsistencies in his story raised red flags. Police began to dig deeper, and they discovered that Garavito had been moving throughout Colombia for years, always in areas where children had gone missing. They searched his belongings and found maps, diaries, and items that belonged to missing children. Confronted with the evidence, Garavito confessed. He admitted to taking the lives of at least 140 children, though he claimed the exact number was higher. He walked investigators through his crimes in chilling detail, even leading them to burial sites they hadn't yet discovered. The scale of Garavito's crimes was almost incomprehensible. Colombia had been dealing with violence for years, but this was different. This was systematic, predatory, and targeted at the most vulnerable members of society. The public was horrified. Families who had been searching for missing children were given the devastating confirmation that their loved ones were gone. The legal system scrambled to respond to a case unlike anything they had seen before. Garavito was charged with 138 confirmed cases of taking lives, along with numerous other crimes. His trial was swift. He pleaded guilty and cooperated with authorities, hoping for leniency. Under Colombian law at the time, the maximum prison sentence was 40 years, and cooperation could reduce that further. Despite the enormity of his crimes, Garavito was sentenced to 30 years in prison, later reduced to 22 years due to his cooperation. The sentence sparked outrage. Families of the victims and the public at large couldn't understand how someone responsible for so many deaths could potentially be released. Luis Alfredo Garavito is currently incarcerated in Colombia, and his case has prompted significant legal and social reform. Colombia has since changed its laws regarding sentencing for mass crimes, and there have been efforts to ensure that Garavito never walks free. Authorities have stated that even if he completes his sentence, they will seek additional charges or psychiatric detention to keep him behind bars. Garavito himself has given interviews from prison, attempting to portray himself as remorseful, but many see his words as manipulative and self-serving. The impact of Garavito's crimes is still felt in Colombia today. Families are still searching for answers. Communities have had to grapple with the loss of an entire generation of children, and the case has become a symbol of the systemic issues that allowed such a predator to operate for so long: poverty, lack of resources, and a criminal justice system overwhelmed by other crises. Imagine a man who could look a child in the eye, offer them kindness, and then commit unthinkable violence. That's the nightmare of Luis Alfredo Garavito. His story is a reminder of the darkest capabilities of human nature and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable among us. The beast may be in prison, but the scars he left behind will never fully heal. Number 7, Gary Leon Ridgway. He was called the Green River Killer, and for nearly 2 decades he was one of the most wanted criminals in America. Gary Ridgway wasn't a drifter or a loner who lived in the shadows. He was a married man with a steady job, someone who blended seamlessly into suburban life. And yet, behind that ordinary facade, he was responsible for taking the lives of at least 49 women, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, but he grew up in the Seattle area. His childhood was difficult. He struggled in school, was known to have a low IQ, and had a complicated relationship with his mother. As an adult, Ridgway seemed to live a relatively normal life. He worked as a truck painter for over 30 years, married multiple times, and was described by neighbors as polite and unremarkable. But there was a darkness inside him that no one saw. Beginning in the early 1980s, women began disappearing from the Seattle-Tacoma area, particularly along the SeaTac Strip, an area known for street work. These were vulnerable women, many dealing with substance use or homelessness, and their disappearances didn't always trigger immediate alarm. But in 1982, the bodies started appearing. Many were found in or near the Green River, which is how the killer got his name. The victims had been strangled, and their bodies had been dumped in remote wooded areas. It became clear that a serial killer was operating in the region, and the Green River Task Force was formed to investigate. For years, the case went cold. The bodies kept appearing, dozens of them, but investigators had no solid leads. They interviewed thousands of people, including Gary Ridgway. He had been brought in for questioning multiple times because he had been seen in areas where victims disappeared, and he admitted to frequenting the locations where street workers operated. But without physical evidence, they couldn't charge him. Ridgway even passed a polygraph test in 1984, which led investigators to move on to other suspects. Meanwhile, the killing continued. By the early 1990s, the number of victims had climbed into the 40s, but the cases remained unsolved. Then, in 2001, advances in DNA technology changed everything. Investigators decided to retest evidence from some of the earliest crime scenes, and this time, they got a match. DNA found on several victims matched Gary Ridgway. On November 30th, 2001, Ridgway was arrested at his workplace. He was calm, cooperative, and showed no signs of resistance. But when confronted with the DNA evidence, he knew the game was over. Ridgway initially maintained his innocence, but as the evidence mounted, his legal team made a decision. They approached prosecutors with a deal. Ridgway would confess to all of his crimes and provide details about the locations of victims' remains in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The prosecution agreed, believing that giving families closure was worth more than executing Ridgway. Over the course of several months, Ridgway confessed to taking the lives of 49 women, though he suggested the actual number might be higher. He walked investigators through his crimes with disturbing precision, explaining how he targeted vulnerable women, how he gained their trust, and how he ended their lives. He often returned to the dump sites to commit further acts, treating the victims as objects rather than people. In 2003, Gary Ridgway pled guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He later pled guilty to a 49th count in 2011 after additional evidence came to light. He was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional life sentence. During his sentencing hearing, families of the victims were given the opportunity to address him. Many expressed their grief, anger, and disgust. Some forgave him. Others told him they hoped he would suffer. Ridgway sat quietly, showing little emotion. Gary Ridgway is currently incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He's been interviewed extensively by law enforcement, psychologists, and journalists, all trying to understand what drove him to commit such horrific acts. Ridgway has said he targeted women involved in street work because he believed they wouldn't be missed, and because he felt a mixture of desire and hatred toward them. His explanations are cold, clinical, and devoid of genuine remorse. The Green River Killer case had a profound impact on the Pacific Northwest. Families waited decades for answers, and many victims were never identified. The case also highlighted systemic issues in how crimes against marginalized women were investigated and prioritized. It prompted changes in how law enforcement handles missing persons cases and how they utilize forensic technology. Imagine living in a community where women are disappearing for years and the person responsible is someone you see every day at work, at the store, in your neighborhood. That's the chilling reality of Gary Ridgway. He was hiding in plain sight, and it took 2 decades to stop him. His story is a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like everyone else. Number 8. Moses Sithole. He's known as the ABC Killer and the South African Strangler, and his crimes sent shockwaves through a nation still reeling from the end of apartheid. Moses Sithole targeted vulnerable women with promises of help and employment, only to lead them to isolated locations where he would commit unspeakable acts of violence. By the time he was caught, he had taken the lives of at least 38 women, making him one of the most deadly serial killers in South African history. Moses Sithole was born in 1964 in Vosloorus, South Africa. He grew up during the height of apartheid, in a society marked by systemic inequality and violence. His childhood was difficult. He lost his father at a young age, and he and his siblings ended up in foster care after their mother couldn't support them. Sithole later claimed he was mistreated in the foster system, and he developed a deep mistrust of authority. As a young adult, he was arrested for an offense he claimed he didn't commit, and he served time in prison. He emerged bitter, resentful, and carrying a grudge against women, whom he blamed for his troubles. In 1994, shortly after his release from prison, a string of disappearances began in the Gauteng province, particularly around Johannesburg and Pretoria. The victims were all women, mostly young and unemployed, and they were last seen responding to job advertisements or meeting with a man who promised them work. Sithole would pose as a businessman or employment agent, offering positions that sounded too good to be true. Once he gained their trust, he would lure them to secluded areas, fields, abandoned buildings, wooded regions, where he would attack, assault, and strangle them. He would then leave their bodies in the open, often tying them in a particular way, and leaving behind what appeared to be ritualistic elements. The bodies began appearing in rapid succession, and panic spread through the communities. The locations of the crimes earned Sithole the nickname ABC Killer, as many of the sites started with consecutive letters of the alphabet. Police launched a massive investigation, but Sithole was careful. He moved frequently, used false names, and avoided leaving physical evidence. Witnesses described a well-spoken, charming man who seemed trustworthy, which made it difficult for investigators to pin him down. The breakthrough came in late 1995. One of Seithol's intended victims managed to escape. She went to the police and provided a detailed description of her attacker and the location where he had tried to take her. Investigators began to piece together witness statements and realized they were dealing with a single perpetrator. They identified Moses Seithol as a suspect, and a nationwide manhunt was launched. Seithol went into hiding, but he made a critical mistake. He called a South African radio station and gave an interview, claiming he was innocent and being framed. The call was traced, and authorities closed in. On October 18, 1995, police tracked Seithol to a location in Johannesburg. When they moved in to arrest him, he resisted violently. He was shot and injured during the confrontation, but he survived and was taken into custody. During interrogation, Seithol initially denied everything, but as evidence mounted, he began to confess. He admitted to taking the lives of 38 women, and he provided details about the locations of several bodies that hadn't yet been discovered. His confessions were chilling, delivered with little emotion and an eerie sense of detachment. Moses Seithol was charged with 38 counts of taking lives, as well as numerous counts of assault and other offenses. His trial began in 1996, and it was one of the most high-profile cases in South African legal history. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, forensic findings, witness testimony, and Seithol's own confessions. The defense attempted to argue mental illness, but psychiatric evaluations found Seithol to be fully aware of his actions. The jury found him guilty on all counts. In 1997, Moses Seithol was sentenced to 50 years for each count of taking a life, totaling 2,110 years in prison. He was also sentenced to 12 years for each count of assault. The sentences were to run consecutively, ensuring he would never be released. Moses Seithol is currently incarcerated in a maximum security prison in South Africa, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He has given occasional interviews from prison, and in some of them, he has shown flashes of arrogance, seeming to take pride in the fear he caused. He's expressed no genuine remorse for his victims, and he's blamed society, women, and the justice system for his actions. His case has been studied extensively by criminologists and psychologists trying to understand the mind of someone capable of such sustained violence. The impact of Seithol's crimes on South Africa was profound. The country was in the midst of transition, trying to build a new democratic society, and the case highlighted ongoing issues of violence against women, unemployment, and systemic inequality. It also exposed gaps in the criminal justice system and the challenges of investigating serial crimes in a country with limited resources. Families of the victims have spoken about the pain of losing their loved ones and the frustration of feeling their cases weren't prioritized until it was too late. Imagine being desperate for work, for a chance to support your family, and being promised that opportunity by someone who seems kind and professional. And then imagine realizing too late that you've been led into a trap by a predator. That's the horror Moses Seithol inflicted on his victims. His story is a reminder of how vulnerability can be weaponized and how evil can disguise itself as kindness. Number 9. Marcel Wayne Williams. He was known as the North Little Rock serial killer, and his crimes in 1994 left a community in fear and mourning. Marcel Wayne Williams targeted women in Arkansas, attacking them in their own homes and leaving behind scenes of unimaginable violence. His case became one of the most notorious in the state's history, and it ended with a death sentence that would take decades to carry out. Marcel Wayne Williams was born on October 2, 1962. Not much is widely known about his early life, but by the time he reached adulthood, he had already accumulated a criminal record. He had been in and out of trouble with the law, and he had a history of violent behavior. In 1986, he was convicted of assault and served time in prison. After his release, he returned to the Little Rock area, where he lived a transient lifestyle, moving between residences and struggling to maintain steady employment. To those who knew him casually, he might have seemed like just another troubled individual trying to get by. But in 1994, he became something far more dangerous. Between February and April 1994, a series of horrific crimes took place in North Little Rock and the surrounding areas. The victims were women, and they were attacked in their homes. Williams would break in, usually at night, and assault his victims before taking their lives. The crimes were brutal, and the level of violence was shocking even to seasoned investigators. The first known victim was Stacy Erickson, a 22-year-old woman found deceased in her home in February 1994. Then came Deborah Reese, a 34-year-old mother. Next was Cheryl Ann Shelton, followed by Joni Bell. Each scene told the same story: forced entry, extreme violence, and a killer who showed no mercy. As the number of victims grew, panic spread through the community. Women were terrified to be alone in their homes. Neighbors organized watch groups. Law enforcement launched a massive investigation, but for weeks they had few solid leads. The breakthrough came in April 1994. A woman named Carrie Ann Smith was attacked in her home, but she survived. She was able to provide a description of her attacker, and that description matched a man who had been seen in the area around the time of the other crimes. Investigators identified Marcel Wayne Williams as a suspect, and they moved quickly. On April 26, 1994, Williams was arrested. During questioning, Williams initially denied involvement, but as evidence was presented, forensic findings, witness testimony, physical evidence from the crime scenes, his story began to fall apart. He eventually confessed to multiple crimes, admitting that he had broken into homes and attacked women. He showed little remorse during his confessions, speaking about the crimes in a detached, matter-of-fact manner. Investigators were able to link him conclusively to 4 deaths, though they suspected he might have been involved in others. Marcel Wayne Williams was charged with 4 counts of capital murder, along with numerous other offenses. His trial took place in 1995, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, witness testimony from the survivor, and Williams's own confessions. The defense attempted to argue mitigating factors, pointing to Williams's troubled background and history of mental health issues, but the jury was unmoved. They found him guilty on all counts. During the sentencing phase, the jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge agreed. Marcel Wayne Williams was sentenced to death and sent to Arkansas's death row. For more than 2 decades, Williams remained in prison as his case went through the appeals process. His legal team filed numerous motions, challenging various aspects of the trial and sentencing, but each appeal was denied. Meanwhile, Arkansas had largely stopped carrying out executions due to legal and procedural issues. But in 2017, the state announced it would resume executions, and Marcel Wayne Williams was one of the individuals scheduled. On April 24, 2017, after 22 years on death row, Marcel Wayne Williams was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit in Arkansas. He was 54 years old. In his final statement, he offered apologies to the families of his victims, though the words rang hollow to many who had followed the case. The execution of Marcel Wayne Williams brought a sense of closure to some, but for the families of his victims, the pain has never fully gone away. These were women who were attacked in their own homes, in places where they should have felt safe. The case had a lasting impact on the North Little Rock community, and it prompted discussions about home security, the criminal justice system, and the death penalty. Imagine being in your own home, in your own bed, and having someone break in with the intent to harm you. That's the nightmare Marcel Wayne Williams brought into the lives of his victims. His story is a reminder of the importance of vigilance, the need for justice, and the devastating impact of violence on families and communities. Some cases are so dark, so senseless, that they leave scars that never fully heal. This is one of them. Number 10. Colin Hatch. He was a man who was given a second chance and used it to take the life of another innocent child. Colin Hatch's case is one that exposes the failures of the criminal justice system and raises painful questions about rehabilitation, risk assessment, and public safety. His crimes left two families devastated and a nation asking how such a tragedy could have been allowed to happen. Colin Hatch was born in 1953 in England. Not much is known about his early years, but by the 1990s, he had already committed a horrific crime. In 1993, Hatch was convicted of taking the life of a 7-year-old boy named Sean Williams. Sean had been playing near his home in London when Hatch lured him away. Hatch assaulted and then ended the young boy's life, leaving his body in a hidden location. The crime was monstrous, and the community was devastated. Hatch was arrested, tried, and convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Instead of receiving a murder conviction, he was sentenced to indefinite detention in a psychiatric hospital. Hatch spent years in institutional care, and over time, mental health professionals assessed him and determined that he had made progress. In 2003, after a decade in secure psychiatric care, a decision was made to release Colin Hatch. The conditions of his release included supervision and monitoring, but the decision was controversial. Families of victims, child safety advocates, and members of the public expressed concern that Hatch posed an ongoing risk. But the system deemed him fit for conditional release, and he was allowed back into society. For several years, Hatch lived under supervision. He was required to check in with authorities, and there were supposed to be safeguards in place to monitor his behavior. But in July 2011, those safeguards failed. Colin Hatch encountered a young boy in Stratford, East London. The boy's name was not widely released to protect his privacy, but what is known is that Hatch approached him, gained his trust, and led him to a secluded area. There, Hatch assaulted and took the life of the child, repeating the same horrific pattern from nearly 2 decades earlier. The boy's body was discovered, and investigators quickly identified Colin Hatch as a suspect. He was arrested and taken into custody. The community was in shock. How had someone with Hatch's history been allowed to be in a position where he could harm another child? The outrage was immediate and widespread. Media outlets covered the case extensively, and questions were raised about the decision-making process that had led to Hatch's release. Before Hatch could stand trial, the case took a final, dark turn. On January 7, 2011, while being held in custody at Full Sutton Prison in Yorkshire, Colin Hatch was found deceased in his cell. The official cause was ruled as self-inflicted, and the case was closed. He never faced trial for his second crime, and he never had to answer in court for the pain he had caused. The death of Colin Hatch did not bring closure to the families affected by his crimes. The family of Sean Williams, who had been forced to relive their trauma when Hatch offended again, spoke out about their anger and grief. The family of the second victim was left with questions and heartbreak. Both families expressed frustration with a system that they felt had failed to protect their children. The case prompted a serious review of the policies surrounding the release of individuals convicted of serious violent offenses, particularly those involving children. Investigations revealed that there had been warning signs that Hatch might still pose a risk, but those signs had either been missed or not taken seriously enough. The case became a catalyst for changes in how the UK assesses and manages individuals convicted of offenses against children, particularly when mental health issues are involved. It also reignited debates about whether certain individuals, particularly those who commit crimes against children, should ever be released back into society. Imagine being the parent of a child who was harmed by someone the system had deemed safe. Imagine the rage, the helplessness, the betrayal. That's what the families of Colin Hatch's victims have had to live with. His story is a stark reminder that the justice system, for all its intentions, is not infallible. Decisions about release and rehabilitation have real consequences, and when those decisions go wrong, the cost is measured in lives. Colin Hatch's name will forever be associated with tragedy and systemic failure. His case is a reminder that protecting the vulnerable must always be the priority, and that second chances should never come at the expense of public safety. Some wounds never heal, and some mistakes can never be undone. This is one of those cases.